Dyatlov Pass is a very famous story about these hikers that go missing in the 1950s. They were hiking into the Ural Mountains to take this thing called their Level 3 hiking test.
Unthinkable injuries. A slashed tent. Bodies scattered in the snow. Barefoot, half-naked, mutilated. For over 6 decades, the Dyatlov Pass Incident has baffled scientists, historians, and even governments. Was it a freak avalanche? An alien encounter? A Cold War cover-up? But now, in 2025, the truth is out. And it's far more horrifying than anyone imagined. What really caused 9 elite Soviet hikers to flee into certain death on a frozen mountainside? Who was watching them die in real time? And why was it all buried for decades? Based on declassified documents, forensic breakthroughs, and long-lost evidence unearthed from the snow, this is the most chilling version of the Dyatlov Pass tragedy yet. The hike that shouldn't have ended. In the dead of winter, January 1959, 10 of the Soviet Union's most elite hikers set off on a grueling ski trek through the unforgiving Ural Mountains. They weren't amateurs. These were students and recent graduates of the Ural Polytechnical Institute, hardened by training, certified for the most extreme weather, and prepared down to the gram for a 16-day expedition. At the helm was 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, an engineering prodigy and a leader known for his discipline. Their destination? Mount Otorten, a remote ice-shrouded peak locals feared and called "Don't Go There Mountain." It was a challenge few dared attempt, but the group was confident. They had mapped every route, packed redundancies of food and supplies, and left careful instructions with friends and families. If anyone could complete this journey, it was them. But even perfect planning couldn't prepare them for what awaited. Early into the journey, one hiker, Yuri Yudin, fell ill. His decision to turn back would save his life. The remaining 9, Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, Doroshenko, Slobodin, Krivonishenko, Thibaut Brignol, Zolotaryov, Dubinina, and Kolevatov, pressed on into deeper snow and denser forests. The final leg of their journey would take them into a harsh, windswept pass near Mount Kolat-Syakhl, a name that translated eerily from the local Mansi language as Mountain of the Dead. Still, they weren't deterred. The tent was discovered pitched on a clear slope, quite contrary to exposure to the elements. Dyatlov is known mostly for making methodical decisions. If they had chosen the slope, there was a reason. What happened next erased every single line of logic. The group did not return on the scheduled date. Search parties were sent. What rescuers discovered was alarming and very confusing at the same time. The slits at the tent's top were made from within. Their boots and jackets were there and not used, as well as food and other supplies. It was clear the hikers stormed into the night with no gear, without arms, only in some cases without clothes. This has nothing to do with a simple retreat. It was havoc. Outside, footprints led away from the tent, barefoot, wearing only socks, or in some cases, nothing at all. The prints disappeared into the woods, swallowed by snowdrifts. Only silence for miles. And that was when the bodies began to come out. First, 2 found lying together under a cedar tree. Barefoot, half-clothed. Nearby, the telltale remnants of a fire offered hints of a desperate bid for survival. 3 more bodies were found later, some distance apart between the tree line and the tent, as though they had collapsed while running. All 5 bore signs of extreme trauma: frostbite, shattered knuckles, and bloodied hands. But that was only the beginning. Why would trained, rational hikers slash their own tent and run barefoot into sub-zero temperatures? Why would they abandon supplies, shelter, and survival, their most basic instincts? And what unseen terror could trigger such madness? The deeper rescuers searched into the snow, the more horrifying the answers would become. Ravine of secrets and silent screams. What the search teams uncovered next turned a mystery into a nightmare. Nearly 2 months after the first bodies were found, a thaw in the snow revealed the remaining 4 hikers in a ravine 75 meters deeper into the forest. But their condition shattered any belief that this was a simple tragedy caused by weather or disorientation. These bodies didn't just freeze to death. They had been through something violent, something brutal. 3 of them were huddled together as if seeking warmth, partially clothed in garments stripped from the earlier deceased group members. But these weren't signs of simple hypothermia. They were markers of survival desperation. The 4th body, Ludmila Dubinina, was found with her ribs crushed and her tongue missing, cleanly severed, not torn by scavengers, not damaged by the environment, removed, as if by force. Her eyes were missing, sockets hollowed out, her face frozen in agony. It was not an isolated case. Alexander Zolotaryov, one of the older hikers and a seasoned veteran, suffered a similar fate. His chest was caved in with such force that forensic experts compared the trauma to that of a car crash. Yet his body showed no external bruising, no lacerations, no sign of a fall, as if the internal organs had simply imploded. Another hiker, Nikolai Thibault Brignol, had a massive skull fracture that would have rendered him unconscious instantly, but again, with no signs of external damage. These weren't the injuries of someone who stumbled in the dark or collapsed from cold. They were blunt force traumas of a different magnitude. The strange injuries went on. Rustam Slobodin had a smaller fracture in his skull. His body looked as though it had fallen face first in the snow and never risen again thereafter. Yuri Krivonishenko's body had been found with burns on hands and feet, as well as being skinned off his fingers, like he was frantically climbing a tree, or had fought something invisible. Most terrifying of all, dozens of the hikers showed signs of bleeding in their inner ears, maybe an indicator of high pressure or concussion caused by an explosion. But it isn't only how they died, it is how they were found. Their final positions told a tale about confusion, about fear and panic. Some were crawling, some were reaching. None indicated that they fought against each other. There was no dispute within, no struggle between friends. Whatever had struck them down came from outside, something that cannot be explained, something that cannot be escaped. What the rescuers saw in that ravine was not death. It was a scene that was itself an unfathomable paradox. It was something that the Soviet authorities could not fully explain or manage. Thus, they suppressed it. Classified stamps were stamped on the documents. Photographs were hidden. The public was told something vague which amounted to an unknown, compelling force. But in secret, experts spoke of discrepancies that did not add up, evidence that was lost, and autopsy reports that were tampered with or deleted. This wasn't a simple case of hikers caught in the cold. It was a massacre disguised as a mystery, and the truth would remain buried until decades later, when someone finally decided to dig deeper. Radiation trails and forbidden experiments. If the mutilated bodies weren't disturbing enough, the autopsy reports raised an even darker question. Why were several of the hikers' clothes contaminated with high levels of radiation? Not just trace elements, but elevated readings of isotopes like beta emitters, the kind you'd expect to see in a laboratory or near a nuclear incident. At the time, Soviet authorities provided no explanation, but in truth, they knew exactly what they were hiding. The Soviet Union had experienced a catastrophic nuclear waste disaster just 2 years earlier in 1957, the Kishtim disaster. A facility near Chelyabinsk had released radioactive waste into the environment, contaminating large areas in the Ural region. Soviet officials covered it up completely. But 2 of the Dyatlov hikers had professional or family ties to that very facility. Initially, this seemed like a coincidence. But now, with the benefit of time and declassified records, it's clear. They weren't just unlucky hikers. They were walking through a contaminated testing ground. In 2025, a new forensic study using advanced isotopic analysis revealed something chilling. The radiation found on the hikers' clothing did not match the isotopes from the Kishtim disaster. Instead, they came from exotic, short-lived radioactive materials, the kind used in secret Cold War weapons experiments. These were not the slow-decaying isotopes spread by environmental disasters. They were fast-fading, unstable, and rarely used outside of military labs. The only plausible explanation? The hikers walked straight into the middle of a top-secret military weapons test. And it wasn't just radiation. There were rumors that the Soviet military was experimenting with non-conventional warfare, radiological weapons, acoustic devices, and even neurological disruptors. Technologies designed not to explode, but to confuse, disable, and disorient. Weapons that could cause internal injuries without visible wounds. Weapons that could shatter bones or burst blood vessels without firing a single bullet. The signs had all been there. The burns found on the hands of Krivonischenko. The internal injuries found in his chest. The burst of his retinal vessels. The strange way some of the victims had stripped their clothing, which could occur in cases of hypothermia, would also fall under intense neurological distress. And then, most terribly damning of all, was the Soviet government forbidding to sealing of the files, destroying any photographs, and punishing anyone, journalist or government official, who looked too closely into what had happened there. By 1960, the Dyatlov Pass case was discreetly closed, with an artificial explanation. An unknown, compelling force. But those behind the closed doors knew better. Declassified military secret orders from that year demanded that all personnel restrict the conversations related to any weapon tests carried out in the Urals. Civilian search groups had to collaborate with military handlers. Some bodies were moved even before they could be photographed. The evidence was purposely tampered with, hidden, or outright destroyed. This was more than an unfortunate accident. It had turned into a secret operation gone horribly wrong. The hikers were not the target. They were witnesses, and that made them expendable. Reports of strange lights witnessed in the sky on that night after years by survivors from nearby regions. They said that some were glowing orbs, while others described them as silent flashes. Sources indicate that the Soviet aircraft logs from that particular period vanished long ago, with no flight records ever existing. But recently, a logbook worth $19.59, hidden in military archives, came to light and contained an unsettling entry dated February 2nd. E1079, perimeter breach. Non-military presence detected. Observation mode initiated. That code, E1079, would be later put with a weapons experiment that the Soviet Union denied ever conducting. Those hikers were never meant to see what they saw. Something powerful, illegal, and catastrophically unsafe. And in the name of secrecy, the government erased them, one broken body at a time. What comes next will take that hidden agenda and tear it wide open. Because one piece of technology, buried beneath the snow for 66 years, would finally resurface. And it would change everything. The sealed box beneath the ice. It was March 2025 when a joint international expedition made the discovery that would finally tilt the Dyatlov mystery into the realm of undeniable truth. What they uncovered wasn't just new evidence, it was a buried confession, one forged in steel, lead, and fire. Deep beneath the permafrost near the ravine where 4 of the hikers had died in grotesque, inexplicable fashion, ground-penetrating radar identified something unnatural, a rectangular shape, heavily shielded and oddly precise in its dimensions. What emerged was a corroded, lead-lined military container. Ice had nearly fused it into the landscape. Its surface was worn, the red Soviet star faded, but still recognizable. At first glance, it could have been dismissed as old war debris, until the team pried it open. Inside was a time capsule of horror, a singed military insignia, a shattered instrument housing, and most damning of all, a charred, half-burned logbook sealed inside a waxed canvas sleeve. The ink was faded, but conservation experts stabilized the fragments. The words that emerged were like a confession whispered from beyond the grave. Operation E-179. Test perimeter breached. Civilian casualties are likely. Immediate concealment protocol initiated. The coordinates matched the Dyatlov campsite. The dates matched the week of the incident. But this wasn't just a coincidence. It was confirmation. The group of 9 hikers had unknowingly set up camp on the edge of a classified Soviet military experiment. Worse, the test wasn't passive. The box's contents included fragments of a dispersal device, likely intended to radiate or emit low-frequency waves as part of an early psychological warfare field test. Scrawled in pencil, barely legible, one sentence from a field officer's notes stood out. Subjects remain within proximity. No extraction. Proceed with Phase 2. That decision would seal their fate. The officer's name and unit number were also in the log. Cross-referencing recently declassified Soviet archives revealed that he belonged to a now-defunct unit under the Ministry of Defense, Unit 743, which had been tasked with developing and testing experimental weapons deemed too unpredictable for conventional battlefields. These weren't just war machines, they were psychological and physiological disruptors, designed to confuse, incapacitate, or destroy silently and invisibly. The logs described not one, but 2 devices. One radiological, probably the source of the exotic isotopes later found on the hikers' clothes, while the other was labeled simply Resonant Disruptor, Mobile, a reference to acoustic weapon system that utilized infrasonic frequencies to induce panic, hallucinations, and other physical discomforts. It was the horror of the devices that were not only tested, but also monitored. The log told of biometric readers, infrared sensors, live tracking equipment, and such placed throughout the area. This meant that the military had as much sight of the hikers as they had seen them flee from their tent, monitor heart rates, movements, and probably even their dying moments. And never came a single help. There was an after-action entry that read, "Perimeter breached. Seal it and secure it. No public record. Thread a narrative together." This single sentence entrenches a suspicion held by some for decades, that the original investigation of 1959 was really just a cover-up. The strange inconsistencies in the official reports, the missing evidence, and the conclusions that were forced were not just signs of incompetence, but were planned obfuscation. More than anything else, the condition of the box haunted researchers. The charring of the log and the container were witnesses to a hurried burial effort done probably within a day or 2 after the hikers' demise. What took place on that slope was a failure to contain something, but also a disaster that the Soviet military wanted to wipe from memory. The closest they came to succeeding, paranormal, alien, and natural theories remained on the table for over 60 years, by which point the truth became cold, calculated, and hauntingly human. But that wasn't the only buried secret left behind. The real horror came not just from what the hikers saw, but who was watching them. The system that watched them die. There's a difference between tragedy and execution. What the Dyatlov group endured had long been considered a mysterious natural disaster. But the evidence uncovered in 2025 transformed that narrative into something far more chilling. A controlled environment where their suffering was observed in real time. The sealed box beneath the ice might have provided the smoking gun, but what followed was the blueprint of an invisible machine, one designed not to slay, but to monitor death. Shortly after the discovery of Operation E-1079's logbook, a tranche of declassified Soviet military documents was released through a joint archival agreement between Russian and international forensic historians. Among the files were schematics, correspondence, and internal orders detailing the infrastructure built to support field tests in the eastern slopes of the Ural Mountains. It wasn't just a single experiment. It was an integrated surveillance and testing grid, the kind of system that shouldn't have existed in 19th. According to these documents, the military had installed a series of concealed biometric sensors disguised as permafrost monitoring stations, each equipped with radio transmitting capabilities. These devices were designed to collect and relay physiological data, heart rates, body temperature, movement patterns, up to 500 meters from their point of origin. One station was confirmed to be less than 300 meters from where the Dyatlov hikers made camp. This wasn't crude Cold War technology, it was eerily advanced, not just capable of recording, but of interpreting biological stress signals. And most disturbingly, the system had thermal imaging capability, meaning the hikers were being tracked in the pitch-black darkness of a mountain night. For what purpose? Official internal memos reveal a haunting objective: to test the effectiveness of new radiological and acoustic deterrent systems against unwitting subjects. The hikers weren't simply collateral damage, they were case studies. A document titled Test Subject Behavior Under Remote Irradiation and Infrasound Exposure included timestamps, GPS-like coordinates, and cryptic entries like Subject Group Elevated Stress, 0204 Local. Flight behavior initiated without external contact. Confirmed exposure threshold surpassed. Deploy resonance field. This was a live experiment, and the Dyatlov group was the experiment. A transmission summary from one report, signed by a major from Unit 743, contained the words, "Active observation, no intervention." This was under protocol, where agents were to intervene in no way with the outcome of any event, even if it was with the utmost imperative that the test group be screaming in pain or imminent death under the condition of dying. The last of the biosignatures tracked recorded complete neural shutdown in 5 of the hikers between 0241 and 0310, and the other 4 signatures disappeared shortly thereafter, with the biometric migration into the ravine. Not a single distress signal was acknowledged. No alert was raised. The system merely logged, catalogued, and suspended its work until the utter silence fell on the last of them. There was even additional evidence suggesting that atmospheric drones, glider-based units meant to either deploy or amplify infrasound, were engaged on the above-mentioned date and night. One technician's log alleged that a testing drone malfunctioned, diminishing flight altitude towards the Kholat Syakhl Ridge. This might have caused distress in the hikers, leading to the bizarre behavior of disorientation, nausea, fear, or hallucinations, abandoning the safety of their tent into sub-zero conditions without shoes or coats. One such instruction read, "Team will find collapsed tent, evidence of avalanche. Do not deviate from the assigned narrative." That is how much control was exerted. From the physical monitoring to the manipulation of the narrative, any cover-up was embedded within the experiment. They gathered the hikers' things not to return them to their families, but to keep them from prying eyes. Personal diaries, undeveloped film rolls, and gear marked with trace radiation were confiscated and either destroyed or misfiled in archives where they could forever remain hidden. Only a handful of possessions, scattered, incomplete, managed to slip through the tentacles of this state-controlled beast. But even this wasn't the end of the nightmare. Because in the next revelation, we learn about the final images captured by the hikers themselves, frames that the system didn't erase in time. Images that show something in the sky above Dyatlov Pass that night and raise one final, terrifying question. Were the hikers alone on that mountain? Their final photos. For decades, the last photos taken by the Dyatlov hikers were considered little more than eerie snapshots of a doomed expedition. But with the technological breakthroughs of 2025, those frozen images were no longer just history. They became forensic evidence, And what they revealed went far beyond what anyone expected. Among the items recovered near the collapsed tent in 1959 were several cameras. Most had been damaged by moisture and cold, their rolls of film long assumed irrecoverable. But those film canisters were preserved in sealed archives, and when modern digital enhancement technology and spectral photo restoration were applied, the results were haunting. One roll belonged to hiker Semyon Zolotaryov, an older, more mysterious member of the group whose late addition to the expedition had always raised eyebrows. He had kept his camera on his person at all times, even as the group fled into the snow. His camera, frozen to his body when it was found, held the final photos ever taken by the Dyatlov group. And they weren't of snowy landscapes or group poses. They were of the sky. The restored sequence began innocently. Blurry shots of the group setting up camp, smiling despite the wind. But the final frames turned darker, both literally and symbolically. The penultimate image showed the tent from a strange angle, possibly taken during a moment of confusion or sudden alert. Then, a blurred flash of light. And then, the last frame. In the final photo, captured with surprising clarity for a Cold War-era lens, was a glowing, structured object suspended in the night sky. It wasn't a star. It wasn't a flare. It was oval, possibly metallic, with 3 distinct light sources in a triangular pattern. Its outline shimmered slightly, as if disturbed by atmospheric interference. To the left of the object was a faint streak, perhaps a contrail or something in motion. The surrounding terrain was visible in silhouette, confirming the photo was taken from just outside the tent, facing the tree line where the hikers would later be found dead. Forensic light analysis confirmed that the object was emitting, not reflecting, light. Its presence was not an illusion, and the way the group responded in the moments that followed suggests they saw it too. It was even more frightening what was missing. Experts then examined the negatives under the heat-mapped contrast imaging to clearly see where one frame had somehow been manually excised from the roll just beforehand. Right before the last photo. It had not gone out in the development, rather, it had been cut cleanly within that strong incision through the film edge, rendering it surgical, probably to eliminate whatever had been there a moment before to capture with clear cuts between the two. This raises the disturbing question: who removed that frame, and why? Some speculated it to be the cause of the photographer himself. But Semyon's frozen and lifeless body was found with a camera sealed to its chest. The intervention of Soviet authorities, always known for their cold ruthlessness, was likely. However, there is no formal word about the photo roll being declared missing or tampered with, which leaves open another perspective, that the camera had been in someone's hands before being returned to the body. To weigh the theory of external interference, further testimony was obtained from local members of the Mansi tribes and meteorological outposts in the region. On the night of February 1st, numerous eyewitnesses claimed to have seen glowing orbs and moving lights in the sky above the Ural Mountains. Such observations had been dismissed as folklore, or worse, hysteria. But the photographic evidence corroborated the witnesses. But these photographs were disquieting not only for what they showed above the sky. One of the earliest frames, now reprocessed with colored layers, shows a figure in the background close to the tree line. Whether it is a member of the party or an unknown third party is not clear. The figure is upright, still, and seemingly watching. Its dimensions appear to be off, way too tall. Limbs are way too skinny. It got no one in 1959. In 2025, it was the only thing that anyone was even talking about. All of this, the glowing object, the missing frame, the watching figure, paints a picture of a group that was not alone. They may have stumbled onto something forbidden, a secret weapons test, a surveillance system that demanded silence, or something else entirely. But what pushed them to flee barefoot into lethal cold, to slash their own tent from within, to die in positions of agony and confusion? Why the truth was buried. For over 6 decades, the Dyatlov Pass Incident was a shadow cloaked in silence, a national wound that refused to heal. Official reports were vague. Eyewitnesses were silenced. Evidence was locked away. And every attempt to uncover the truth was either dismissed as hysteria or quietly redirected. But the question that haunted generations wasn't just what happened on that frozen slope, it was why no one was ever allowed to know. The truth, as uncovered in 2025, wasn't just horrifying. It was deliberate. A cover-up so complete that it turned the deaths of 9 young adventurers into one of history's most persistent enigmas. Following the discovery of the sealed military container, the declassified documents from Soviet archives revealed the brutal extent of the deception. In cold, clinical language, the files described Operation E-1079, a secret military experiment in radiological and acoustic weapons. The test was never supposed to involve civilians, until the Dyatlov group unknowingly set up camp inside the perimeter of the experimental zone. The Soviet response wasn't one of urgency, but containment. Surveillance logs showed the hikers were monitored in real time, thermal sensors tracking their vital signs, heartbeat by heartbeat. Military assets had visual and auditory confirmation of their distress, and still, no one intervened. The orders were chillingly clear. No contact, no retrieval, no witnesses. Why? Because the weapons being tested weren't just dangerous, they were illegal under international law. Technologies designed to manipulate human behavior using frequency, pressure, and radiation were still in prototype stages. But in the pressure cooker of Cold War escalation, ethics were discarded. Human testing, even unintentional, was a cost Soviet leadership was willing to pay, so long as the world never found out. And that's exactly what they ensured. When the search crews arrived weeks later, they were fed a scripted account of what allegedly transpired. Files were sanitized, autopsy findings were altered, bodies were relocated before photographs could be taken. Wipe any trace of military involvement. Radiation test results were classified. Every witness who suggested otherwise simply disappeared. The more damaging revelations were literally buried. The logs of Operation E-1079 were encased in lead for their burial in deep permafrost, with the belief that the cold would keep any evidence silent for all time. In 2025, the world indeed changed. Behind a convergence of international academic pressure, forensic innovation, and insiders' leaks, the veil was pierced. The truth came to life, only to be uglier than anyone had imagined. This isn't about the head-held high hikers. It's about the people who experienced alien-related, wild conspiracies that were explosions of state violence, silenced victims, and their machinery of secrecy protecting itself at all costs. The members of the Dyatlov group became collateral to a war they didn't know they were grappling with. Chess pieces in a game played in shadows. And the reason the truth remained hidden for such a long time? Fear. Public outrage? Fear. International condemnation? Fear. Fear of unraveling the Soviet myth of control that had been constructed. A myth worth defending by lies, manipulation, and decades of silence, exposing the truth. However, ultimately, the truth has a way of breaking through. In 2025, the final piece fell into place not because of political will, but because of the persistence of scientists, researchers, and descendants of the Dyatlov hikers, all refusing to let silence win. So now you know what really happened at Dyatlov Pass. A tragedy buried in ice and in lies. Do you believe this truth should have stayed buried? Or is the world better off finally knowing? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Like this video if you believe the truth matters, no matter how dark it gets. And check out the next episode on screen now for more stories that rewrite history.